In the summer of 1981, 3 weeks before the wedding that would be watched by 750 million people, a photograph was taken in the gardens of Balmoral. The image showed a young woman in a tweed skirt seated on a low stone wall, looking not at the camera but at the man beside her. The man was Charles, Prince of Wales. He was not looking at her. He was looking at something in the middle distance, his jaw set, his hands folded in his lap, with the precision of someone arranging cutlery. The photographer, a member of the royal household staff with a personal camera, took the picture and offered the print to the prince some weeks later as a memento. Charles took the photograph, looked at it for perhaps 4 seconds, and placed it face down in the drawer of a writing desk. He never asked for a copy to be circulated. He never permitted its publication. Even 16 years later, in the days following Diana's death in Paris, when picture editors across the world were begging the palace for any unseen image of the couple in happier times, this particular photograph was not released. It remains, according to those who have seen it, in private royal hands. What that image captured was not happiness, and not even the polite fiction of happiness. It captured a man already calculating the distance between what he felt and what he was required to perform. The story of King Charles III is, in many ways, the story of that distance and of how skillfully and how poorly he has managed it across 7 decades of public life. To understand why a single unpublished photograph matters, one has to understand the world that produced the man inside the frame. Charles Philip Arthur George was born in November 1948 in Buckingham Palace, at a moment when the British monarchy was still recovering from the abdication crisis of 1936 and adjusting itself to a post-war Britain that no longer quite believed in the divine right of anything. His mother, then Princess Elizabeth, was 22 years old. His father, Prince Philip, was a Greek-Danish naval officer with a complicated childhood and a temperament that ran from charming to caustic within the space of a single dinner. When Charles was 3, his mother became queen. From that moment forward, his upbringing was no longer a private matter. It was a matter of constitutional importance. The decisions made about his education were, by the standards of the British establishment at the time, experimental. Earlier princes of Wales had been tutored privately at home. Charles was sent first to Hill House School in Knightsbridge, then to Cheam in Berkshire, and finally to Gordonston in Scotland, the Spartan boarding school in Moray that his father had attended and admired. Gordonston emphasized cold showers, long runs, sailing in heavy weather, and what the school called the building of character through hardship. Charles loathed it. He later described his time there as a sentence served in what he called colditz in kilts, referencing the German prisoner of war castle of the Second World War. Letters he wrote home from school, some of which were later published in unauthorized biographies, describe loneliness, bullying, and the particular cruelty of being a boy whom no one was allowed to be friends with too closely, lest they be accused of currying favor. This matters because it shaped him. The Charles who emerged from Gordonston in 1967 was a young man who had learned that vulnerability was a liability, that affection was conditional, and that the people around him were watching for weaknesses to exploit or report. He went up to Cambridge, read archaeology and anthropology and history, and became the first heir to the British throne to earn a university degree. He served in the Royal Navy. He learned to fly helicopters. He developed an interest in organic farming, classical architecture, watercolour painting, and the philosophical writings of Lawrence van der Post, a South African mystic who would later be discredited as a serial fabulist. but who exercised in the 1970s considerable influence over the prince's developing worldview. By the time he reached his late 20s, Charles had constructed a public persona that the British press described as thoughtful, slightly eccentric, and reassuringly dutiful. He spoke about modernist architecture in ways that infuriated architects. He talked to his plants and admitted it on television. He surrounded himself with older mentors, Lord Mountbatten chief among them, who advised him on the question that was beginning to dominate the national conversation about the heir to the throne. The question was when and to whom he would marry. Mountbatten's advice on this point was specific, and it would prove catastrophic. A man, the elderly admiral counselled his great-nephew, should sow his wild oats freely in his bachelor years, but eventually choose a wife who was, in Mountbatten's exact phrasing, sweet-charactered and not too experienced. The implication was clear. The bride should be young. The bride should be untouched by scandal. The bride should be malleable. Charles, who by this point had been involved with Camilla Shand for several years, a woman his own age, witty, confident, sexually experienced, and the descendant of a former royal mistress, was being told, in effect, that the woman he loved was not suitable for the role he was required to fill. Camilla married Andrew Parker Bowles in 1973, while Charles was at sea with the Navy. The prince was informed by letter. By every account from those who knew him at the time, he did not handle it well. He continued to see Camilla socially throughout the rest of the decade, and he began, with what observers described as a quiet desperation, to audition candidates for the role of Princess of Wales. The first specific anecdote that illuminates this period comes from the spring of 1979 at a polo match at Cowdray Park in Sussex. Charles had been introduced to Lady Sarah Spencer, the elder sister of Diana, 2 years earlier, and had briefly courted her. Sarah, in a moment of candour that would haunt her family for decades, had given an interview to a magazine in which she stated flatly that she would not marry the Prince of Wales if he were the dustman or the King of England, because she was not in love with him. Charles ended the relationship the day the article appeared. At Cowdray that spring, Sarah arrived with her younger sister Diana, then 17 years old. Charles, watching from the sidelines, asked who the tall blonde girl in the green skirt was. He was told. He nodded once. He turned back to his horse. According to a groom who was standing nearby, and who recounted the moment years later to a biographer, the prince said only, "She is very young." He did not approach her that day. The revelation, in retrospect, is that the calculation had already begun. The second anecdote takes place at Petworth House in West Sussex in November 1977, in the boot room. Diana was 16. Charles, then 28, had come to shoot pheasant with the Spencer family, who were old friends of the royals. Diana, home from her Swiss finishing school for the weekend, had been told to make herself useful and to stay out of the way. She was helping to clean shooting boots. Charles came in to change his coat. They spoke for perhaps 10 minutes. Witnesses present, 2 estate workers and Diana's stepmother, Rain Spencer, later gave varying accounts of what was said, but all agreed that Diana, after Charles left the room, sat down on a stool and announced that she had just met the most tragic person she had ever encountered. The reaction from those present was amused dismissal. The revelation, looking back, was that Diana had identified, at 16, the central fact about her future husband. He was not cold. He was sad. And she believed, as so many young women believe about sad men, that she could fix him. The third anecdote occurred at Buckingham Palace in February 1981, the morning after Charles proposed. He had returned from a ski trip in Cloisters and had asked Diana to marry him in the nursery at Windsor, which was the only room in which they were guaranteed privacy. She had said yes immediately, and then laughed because she could not believe he had asked. The following morning, at a small breakfast attended by Charles, the Queen, Prince Philip and the Queen Mother, Charles was asked by a BBC interviewer, who had been granted access for an engagement segment, whether the couple were in love. Diana said yes, simply and without embellishment. Charles paused, smiled the small, tight smile that would become familiar to the British public, and replied, "Reversible in love means." The Queen Mother, witnesses recall, looked at her plate. Philip continued eating. The revelation, broadcast that evening to a nation that wanted only to be told a fairy tale, was that the bridegroom was already 3 weeks into the engagement, signalling that he could not and would not perform the script. The fourth anecdote takes place in the days before the wedding itself, in late July 1981. A gift had arrived at Charles's office at Buckingham Palace from Camilla Parker Bowles, a gold chain bracelet with the engraved initials F and G, standing for Fred and Gladys, the private nicknames the two had used for each other since their relationship in the early 1970s. Charles wore the bracelet at a polo match. He intended to give it to Camilla at a private luncheon before the wedding. Diana, going through his desk in search of a letter she had been told was from his mother, found the bracelet in its box with a note. Witnesses to what followed include Diana's sisters, who were called urgently to Clarence House that evening. Diana, sobbing, told them she could not go through with the wedding. Her sisters, in a phrase that has been quoted in every account of the event since, told her that it was too late, that her face was on the tea towels. The revelation, beneath the dark comedy, was that the bride had understood, 4 days before her wedding, that she was marrying a man who was already, in every meaningful sense, married to someone else. The fifth anecdote belongs to the wedding day itself, the 29th of July, 1981. Among the 750 million who watched the ceremony at St. Paul's Cathedral, fewer than a dozen were paying attention to a specific small moment that occurred as Diana walked up the aisle. She got the order of Charles's names wrong, saying Philip Charles Arthur George instead of Charles Philip Arthur George. The lip readers at home noticed. The press the next day made a brief joke of it. What was not reported, and what only emerged years later from a member of the wedding party who was standing close to the altar, was Charles's reaction. He did not smile. He did not whisper a correction. He looked, for a fraction of a second, at his mother. The witness, who later described the moment to the biographer Jonathan Dimbleby, said the look contained a question, and the question was, "Do I have to go through with this?" The Queen, whether she registered the look or not, did not respond. The revelation was that the wedding itself was, for the groom, an act of duty performed under maternal observation. The sixth anecdote takes place on the honeymoon, aboard the royal yacht Britannia, in August 1981. The yacht was cruising the Mediterranean. Diana, by every account from the staff aboard, was suffering acutely from bulimia, from anxiety, and from the dawning realization that her husband had brought, in his luggage, a stack of letters and photographs from Camilla. Charles spent the days reading the philosophy of Laurens van der Post, whose books he had brought in considerable quantity. He insisted, at meals, on reading passages aloud to Diana and to the senior staff who joined the dinner table. Diana, who was 19, who had left school at 16, and who had no interest in Jungian mysticism, sat through these readings in increasing distress. A steward who served on Britannia during that cruise later recounted that Diana would excuse herself between courses, return with red eyes, and sit through the rest of the meal in silence. The revelation, banal and devastating, was that Charles had not the smallest instinct for what his young wife actually needed, and would not have known how to provide it if he had. The seventh anecdote occurred in October 1981 at Balmoral after the honeymoon. Diana was pregnant with William, was suffering from severe morning sickness, and was begging to return to London. Charles wanted to remain at Balmoral, where he was happiest, where he could walk on the moors and paint, and avoid the demands of the press. A row developed over the breakfast table, observed by 2 members of staff and by the Queen Mother, who was visiting. Diana threw a glass. It missed Charles and shattered against the wall. Charles stood up, picked up his newspaper, and left the room without a word. The Queen Mother, according to a footman present, said only, "How tiresome." The revelation was that the royal family had decided very early which version of events would be retained. Diana was hysterical, Charles was patient, and that this verdict would prove almost impossible to revise. The eighth anecdote of this period belongs to the birth of Prince Harry in September 1984. Diana, by her own later account given to Andrew Morton, had hoped desperately that the second child would be a girl, because she knew Charles wanted a girl. When Harry was born, healthy and male, Charles's first recorded words, spoken in the delivery room and overheard by at least 2 members of the medical staff, were, "Oh God, it's a boy, and he's even got red hair." Diana, who had just given birth without an epidural, registered the comment. She has said in the Morton tapes that something inside her closed at that moment, and that the marriage, in any emotional sense, was over from that day. The revelation is that Charles, who had been raised to perform, had at this critical moment failed to perform, and the failure had been observed and would never be forgotten. The years between 1984 and 1992 are the years in which the marriage became, in the phrase used by the prince's friends, a question of separate establishments. Charles spent increasing amounts of time at Highgrove, his country house in Gloucestershire, and at Birkhall on the Balmoral estate. Diana remained largely in London, at Kensington Palace, raising the children, building her public profile, and developing the philanthropic work on AIDS, on landmines, on homelessness that would eventually eclipse her husband's reputation entirely. Camilla Parker Bowles, who had never fully exited the picture, returned to it in earnest by 1986, by which point Charles was telling friends that the marriage had been a mistake from the beginning. The first of the next series of anecdotes belongs to the summer of 1989, at the 40th birthday party of Camilla's sister, Annabel Elliot, held at Ham Common in southwest London. Diana attended, uninvited and unannounced, having learned that Charles and Camilla would both be present. She arrived after dinner. She went downstairs to a basement room where Charles and Camilla were sitting together. She asked, in front of perhaps a dozen guests who had followed her down out of curiosity, whether she could speak to Camilla privately. Camilla agreed. The 2 women spoke for perhaps 20 minutes. The witnesses upstairs heard raised voices once. When Diana emerged, she went upstairs, found Charles, and said she was leaving. Charles followed her to the front door. In the car on the way home, according to her later account to her voice coach Peter Settleton, Diana wept for the entire journey. The revelation, which only became public years later, was that Diana had told Camilla directly that she knew about the affair and that Camilla had not denied it. The second anecdote of Act 2 takes place in January 1990. A mobile phone conversation between Charles and Camilla was intercepted, almost certainly by an amateur radio enthusiast, possibly by the intelligence services, the matter has never been satisfactorily resolved and recorded. The contents of the conversation, which would become known as Camillagate when they were published in 1993, were extraordinarily intimate and, in places, vulgar in a way that the British public had never associated with the heir to the throne. Charles, in the recording, expressed a fantasy about being reincarnated as an item of feminine hygiene. The reaction, when the transcript appeared in an Australian magazine and then in the British tabloids, was a national paroxysm of embarrassment and ridicule. The revelation was not the vulgarity itself, which was forgivable, but the fact that the future king had been having this conversation while married, while his wife was at home, and while the children were small. The third anecdote belongs to the publication of Andrew Morton's book, Diana, Her True Story, in June 1992. The book, which presented Diana as a victim of a cold husband, a cruel royal family, and an institutional indifference to her suffering, was based on tape-recorded interviews with a friend of Diana's, who passed the tapes to Morton. The royal family did not, at the time, know that Diana herself was the source. Charles, who read the book at Highgrove the weekend it was serialized in the Sunday Times, did not finish it. He left it page-marked on a side table. A house guest that weekend, the writer and gardener Roy Strong, later recorded in his diary that Charles, asked what he thought of the book, said only, "It is a different version of events." The revelation was that Charles, even in private, even to a friend, would not engage with the substance of his wife's accusations. He treated her testimony as one perspective among several. That refusal to engage would define his public response for the next 5 years. The fourth anecdote is the Dimbleby documentary of June 1994, in which Charles, having agreed to a long television interview to mark the 25th anniversary of his investiture as Prince of Wales, was asked by Jonathan Dimbleby whether he had been faithful to his wife. Charles, after a long pause, answered, "Yes, until it became irretrievably broken down." The admission, which had been carefully workshopped in advance with the prince's advisers, was intended to draw a line under the scandal and to reframe the affair with Camilla as a consequence rather than a cause of the marital collapse. The reaction was not what had been hoped. The British public, polled the following week, considered the admission damaging by a margin of 2-1. The Queen, according to her private secretary at the time, was said to be deeply distressed. The Archbishop of Canterbury issued a statement of concern. The revelation was that Charles, in attempting to manage his image through controlled disclosure, had discovered that the British public did not accept the distinction between a marriage that had broken down and a marriage in which a husband had been unfaithful. They were, to most viewers, the same thing. The fifth anecdote belongs to Diana's Panorama interview of November 1995, in which she sat before Martin Bashir and said the line that has been quoted in every account of the period since. "Well, there were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded." Charles watched the interview at Highgrove with 2 friends. He did not speak during the broadcast. When it ended, according to one of those present, he stood up, walked to the window and said, "She is very good at this." The remark, which has been quoted variously as bitter, admiring or resigned, depending on the source, is in fact best understood as analytical. Charles recognized at that moment that his wife had become a more skilled performer on the public stage than he was, and that no statement, no documentary, no carefully calibrated admission would now restore the balance. The revelation was that he understood he had lost, not the marriage, which had been lost years earlier, but the contest for public sympathy. The sixth anecdote takes place on the 31st of August, 1997. Charles was at Balmoral with his sons when the call came through, in the small hours of the morning, that Diana had been involved in a car accident in Paris.